Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Alaska Board of Game meeting. I would like to call the meeting to order at 1:40 p.m. on Wednesday, October 19th, 2022. There are 7 board members present. Before we get started with the business items on the agenda, I'd like to welcome our newest member, Ruth Cusack, who was appointed by Governor Dunleavy last spring. This is Ruth's first meeting with the board, and we are glad to have you on board. Now with the board members, let's have each board member state their name and where they reside. We would normally start with Stosh Hoffman, but I don't think he's in the room yet, so Al.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's great seeing everybody again. And yeah, welcome aboard, Ruth. It'll be fun with you having you on the board. My name is Al Barrett. I'm from Fairbanks and look forward to hearing the updated information on sheep.
Jake.
Hello, Jake Fletcher from Talkeetna. I'm going to echo Al's comments there. I'm looking forward to hearing this updated information.
Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lynn Keogh from Wasilla.
James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. James Cooney from Eagle River, and welcome, Ruth. Looking forward to working with you again.
And Ruth.
My name is Ruth Cusack, and I am from Chugiak. And thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to the meeting.
Okay, is Stosh on yet?
No, Mr. Chairman, he's not.
Okay, this is my name's Jerry Burnett. I reside in Juneau. Let's have our agency representatives introduce themselves and their staff, and we'll start with Deputy Commissioner Ben Mulligan. Who needs to unmute his phone. Mike.
I clicked the button, but not quite in the right spot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Yes, for the record, Ben Mulligan, Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Fish and Game. I know we've got a lot of folks online, but not being totally clear about who will all be giving the presentation. I'll let Ryan Scott mention Division of Wildlife Conservation staff, but I also see Lisa Olson, who heads up our subsistence folks. And if there's anybody else online she'd like to introduce from her shop, I will let her do that. Thank you, sir.
Okay, Lisa, would you have anyone else you'd like to introduce from your shop?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, it's just me attending this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, Ryan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to members of the board. My name is Ryan Scott. I'm the Assistant Director with the Division of Wildlife Conservation down in Juneau, and I'll introduce a couple of folks, and then, Mr. Chairman, you can tell me if you want me to go through the list. Joining us today is Natalie Weber, our regulations coordinator, very familiar to the board. In addition to that, coming to us from Anchorage, we have Tom Loheis, Brad Lindling, and Joe Want, and Kyle Smith. They will be the primary presenters of today's information. And then, as I had indicated to board support a bit ago, we have staff from every region and area office that has sheep management responsibilities online. This is, to answer direct questions, and I'm happy to introduce all of them if you like, or if what I've introduced is sufficient. I think that's good.
I'll leave that to you, Ryan. And Christy.
Yes, hello, Mr. Chairman, members of the board and the department staff and members of the public. I'm Christy Tibbles, the board's executive director based out of rainy Juneau today. And the amazing crew of board support staff behind the scenes helping us are Annie Bartholomew, publication specialist from Juneau, Kyle Campbell, regional coordinator from Fairbanks, Henry Alicia, publication specialist in Anchorage, and Fari Sylvester, regional coordinator in Anchorage. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Lieutenant Justin Rogers on.
Good afternoon. My name is Justin Rogers. I'm the Deputy Commander for Northern Detachment up here in Fairbanks, Alaska, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. And George Pappas, our representative from the Office of Subsistence Management.
Good day, George Pappas, OSM, stationed in Anchorage. It's a great day to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've noticed this is the deepest bench of wildlife biologists I've ever seen.
Okay, have I missed anyone? Okay. And
Mr. Chairman, this is Cheryl Brooking here with the Department of Law.
okay, thank you, Cheryl. Okay, before we start, there's a couple of housekeeping and process items to cover. I'd like to ask board members and staff to please try to stay muted when not speaking. And then remember to take yourself off mute when needed. It's also helpful for board members and staff who are speaking to have their video cameras on if you can. However, there are some of us who have bandwidth limitations and are unable to use the cameras. If you need to speak, I encourage you to use Zoom's hand raise feature, and Christy will help me watch for anyone wanting to speak. You can also just raise your hand if you find you aren't being called upon. The purpose of the board meeting is to receive a report from the Department of Fish and Game on recent survey and harvest data of Dall sheep and future management considerations. Board members will recall from our meeting in March, the board agreed to request this informational meeting based on testimony we heard from individuals, groups, and advisory committees expressing concerns about sheep populations in multiple areas of the state. And the board expressed concern for not having updated population and age class composition for Dall sheep in order to make decisions that are in the best interest of the resource. Following the presentation today by the department, we will have the opportunity to ask questions of the department and have some discussion about what we can expect in the future. I'd like to thank department staff for their work over the summer with sheep surveys and compiling and analyzing the information to present to the board. We're looking forward to hearing the information, as are many listeners. On that note, today's meeting is open to the public and via live stream on the board's website. Audio will also be available after the meeting for those who are unable to listen live. The board is not taking public oral testimony during the meeting. However, we did solicit written comments, which are part of the board meeting record and posted on the meeting website. The board received over 80 comments for this meeting, and we thank those who took the time to express their concerns and ideas on this important topic. Prior to most board meetings, the members would provide ethics disclosure statements. However, since this is an information meeting, board members do not need to provide any statements. And we are not going to be taking up any regulatory actions today. This is an informational meeting. We may decide after this meeting, at our next meeting, to discuss something, but at this meeting, this is for informational purposes only. So go ahead, Ryan, and
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to announce Mr. Hoffman has joined our meeting. He's online, and I apologize to him and everybody else for that difficulty we had.
Mr. Hoffman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if you can hear me, my name is Stanley Hoffman from Bethel.
Thank you. We heard you loud and clear. Okay, at this time, Ryan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board once again. It's good to be back with you all and to talk about sheep after we've heard a lot about it over the last couple of board meetings. I have some very brief comments. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Weber, and then she's going to hand it off to Mr. Loheis and Mr. Windling and Mr. Wan to start the discussion. I also want to thank the board for being patient with us and flexible. I know that there had been some interest in doing this during the summer. As you can imagine, we had a lot going on in the summer, including trying to accomplish sheep surveys and get caribou surveys and photosynthesis done and many other things. So thanks for letting us push it back into the fall. So today we're going to bring you a pretty long presentation. We're going to start with some history about sheep management and sheep biology throughout the state, give you a little bit of a current snapshot of what's going on, talk about some research work that we have going, talk about some of the constraints and challenges that we have as well. And then when we get to the end, we're going to try to lay out some options for the board to consider and for the public to ponder. I guess I want to be clear, the department is not coming with recommendations today. We wanted to provide the information the board wanted. And then as Mr. Chairman, you spoke about, we anticipate other proposals and regulatory actions in future meetings where we'll dig into the details of the proposals as we get them. And I'll remind the board too, we have a board meeting in March in Region 2. Sheep do occur there. And so I'm sure we'll be talking about some sheep there, or sheep issues there. And then following that next year, we'll be back up in Region 3, where sheep are a prime species as well. So anything we talk about today, if you'd like to hear more detail about some of those things, we'll be prepared to talk with the board in the future at those regulatory scheduled meetings or otherwise should you determine. So that's all I have. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Natalie and she'll get us closer to getting rolling.
Thanks, Ryan. Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, my name is Natalie Weber. I'm the Regulations Program Coordinator for the Division of Wildlife Conservation. And we put together a presentation that will cover, as Ryan mentioned, history of sheep in Alaska, current population and harvest information, and hunter participation. It also includes ongoing and future research projects and some other additional information that helps paint a picture of Dall sheep research, management, and hunting in Alaska. The presentation does not include all current population and age class information for every population in the state, though it does contain examples of some of those. And as you listen to the presentation, you'll notice that it also does not get into a great level of detail regarding drawing hunts, registration hunts, or subsistence hunts. So in other words, we focus primarily on everything that is not allocative. So all of those things are left for you guys to discuss at a future meeting. But as the board discusses these issues at future meetings, we'll of course provide all of that detailed information for you, such as positive, customary, and traditional use finding information, land status and access issues, and existing hunt structures for those areas in question. So again, we did not include that for you today, but we have a number of other things for you to consider as you think about this in the future. So with that, we have Tom Loheis ready to go and introduce himself and the rest of the presenters. And we are all waiting in the wings if you have questions.
Good afternoon, Chairman Burnett, members of the board. My name is Tom Loheis. I'm the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's sheep research biologist for South Central Alaska. I'm based in Anchorage. With me today here are Brad Wendling, my research counterpart based in Fairbanks, Kyle Smith, my co-principal investigator on the last 15 or so years of sheep work that we've been doing in South Central, and Mr. Joe Want, who's a longtime sheep expert, hunting guide, and aficionado based in Fairbanks, and now a fish and wildlife technician for us working out of the Fairbanks office. We'll speak and present a broad picture of sheep biology and ecology across the state. I would like to reiterate that area biologists were all asked to be online for area-specific questions. And one final point is that we have slide numbers in the bottom right. If you want to make a note of these, we can refer back to each specific slide when there are questions at the end of the presentation. Give me just a moment. I'm going to get my screen shared. We'll start the presentation. All right. So sheep occur statewide, north to south gradient in 7 major mountain ranges and a few small island populations. North to south, we have sheep in the Brooks, the Central Alaska Range, working south, the Talkeetnas, the Chugach, the Wrangell St. Elias, and the Kenai Mountains, with smaller populations in the White Mountains and the Tanana Hills north of Fairbanks. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Joe Want. Joe will give a general review of Dall sheep populations and some history in the state of Alaska. Brad Wendling will follow him with some examples of more recent population issues, and then I'll come back on and talk about some current harvest and population surveys we've done in some specific game management units. Joe?
Good afternoon, members of the board and public. My name is Joe Wand, and I will be presenting a general review of sheep populations in Alaska from 1880 through 2009. In 1949, a report on the status of Dall sheep in the territory, R.F. Scott wrote, "Hunters entering sheep country in 1945 were astonished to find but a small fraction of the previously known populations. 47 years later, in 1992, the same statement could have been made and was made by a number of individuals. In another 30 years, 2022, we again repeated that statement. In the early 1880s, there were several long winters of deep snow. And during this period, there were a number of other years where we had bad cold winters. From the period of about 1885 through 1910, historically, sheep populations were low in several mountain ranges. Sadly, in the winter of 1906 through 1907, it's estimated that approximately 6 to 8% of the Brooks Range, Central Brooks Range residents of the Central Brooks Range were reported to have succumbed to hunger. And that wasn't due just to a shortage of sheep, it was due to a shortage of all the major animals that those individuals relied on. In 1928, the Alaska Game Commission received testimony from Moore reporting sheep hunting in the headwaters of the Noatak and plenty of sheepskins and sheep sleeping bags in the villages, which strongly suggests that the animals were now available for harvest for the local individuals. In 1939, Agent Collins, who worked for the Alaska Game Commission, reported numerous bands of sheep in north and south of the Noatak. By 1949, Scott, who worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, surveyed the central DeLong Mountains and Hula Hula River, resulted in low counts of 117 and 74 respectively. And it's interesting that in that 74, which represented a Hula Hula, they estimated that population to be at 150, which when compared to numbers that we saw later on, it was substantially low. And this is during 1962 and 1963, I had an opportunity to work as an assistant guide for Pinnell and Tollefson in the Central Brooks Range. Sheep in the Acoma River, Ocmalaga, and Chandalar Lake region were very plentiful. In fact, in one afternoon, we counted over 120 ewes and lambs crossing the saddle between Burden Creek and the Ocmalaga. It's interesting and maybe telling that the bag limit was 2 rams and the season opened on the 20th of July back then. In 1968, Lyman Nichols did a general survey of the Brooks Range. He gathered information from the south slope of the Brooks Range about the general status of game and information from commercial big game guiding operations in the Central Brooks Range. This survey took about 10 days. During the survey, he reported numerous bands of sheep in the Hula Hula. And in a interview with Ray Loshi indicated that there were about 1,000 sheep in the Ocmalaga. And the irony is, if it was half that today, it would be a lot more than what's there right now, at least on the more recent surveys. Ralph Marshall, who was guiding out of the elusive lake on the Ribden River, reported that practically all the mountains with suitable sheep habitat had sheep. Table 1 shows the results of surveys conducted in the Hula Hula River between 1976 and 1986. In 1976, about 1,700 sheep were counted and had increased to about 3,100 over the next 10 years. Irony, subsequent helicopter surveys in 1993 and 1995 produced respective counts of 1,261 and 1,131. This kind of illustrates the importance of the relative perspective of these numbers. The irony is that in 1976, when 1,700 sheep were initially counted, I can remember the excitement at the department for there to be that heavy a concentration of sheep anywhere. In fact, it's as I remember, that was considered to be one of the heaviest concentrations of sheep known to be in North America. Then over the next 10 years, when it increased to 3,100, everybody was really beyond ecstatic because of the increase in density of those sheep. However, after that sheep population dropped to about dropped to about 1,200 in 1993, there was real concern as to whether or not the season should be closed and maybe go to a permit system because of the low numbers. In the 20 years between 1949 and 1968, the herd size on the Kenai is estimated to increase by a multiple of 7, Boulder Creek by a multiple of 10, and Peters Creek by a multiple of 8. And the irony is the Mountain McKinley Park by a multiple of 4.5. This graph gives a general indication of sheep per square mile in 2 different areas. One, Boulder Creek, and the second area, the Eklutna Peters Creek, Eagle River area, just outside of Anchorage. And although these numbers are very general, they show a general trend of the increase in sheep per square mile. This table represents some of the written comments received by the Alaska Game Commission in 1930 regarding sheep populations in various mountain ranges. And the takeaway from this is that in general, across these mountain ranges where they had good lamb production, and the irony is that we see that with some of the other data too, where it's good in one area, it tends to be good across the state. And that's not to say in every mountain range or every pocket, but just as a general statement. Now the inverse is true as well. When there's a hard winter in one mountain range, we tend to see that in other mountain ranges as well, although that's just a general statement. As a general overview, these population cycles occurred in areas whether they were open or closed to hunting. The territory during general seasons of 1902 through 1951, when the restrictions were the general season and they were restricted to males with no horn size or other constraints on what was harvested. Areas that were controlled by permits or general seasons still experience these cycles, and areas with harvest regulated by curl or age restrictions also saw these cycles. The history of sheep population fluctuation is reasonably clear. However, the cause and possible remedies for modifying these cycles is not. And that's the bad news, I guess. With that, I would like to thank the board for the opportunity of making this presentation and turn the rest of the presentation over to Brad Wendling Brad Wendling, Sheep Research Biologist from Fairbanks. And again, thank you for the time.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for members of the board for this opportunity to talk about sheep today. My name is Brad Wendling. I'm the sheep researcher based out of Fairbanks. So we're going to continue along with kind of a historical overview of sheep. In the late 2000s, the Alaska Board of Game was receiving an increased number of proposals from the public to alter the management and regulation of Dall sheep hunting. Most of these proposals reported a decline in the quality of sheep hunts because of an increased crowding or conflict between resident hunters, non-resident hunters, and commercial operators, that being professional guides, transporters, and air taxis that were providing services to the sheep hunters. University of Alaska Fairbanks professor of wildlife biology, Dr. Todd Brinkman, was contracted by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in January of 2014 to collect information for the Board of Game to use when considering changes to sheep hunting regulations. While I will not be going into the results of his research, his findings can be found on the links shown in this slide. In 2015, a sheep working group was formed. The working group membership was intended to represent various users of Dall sheep in Alaska. The expectations and criteria for this working group membership included familiarity in Dall sheep hunting related topics, the ability to explore new ideas and concepts, and the willingness to work towards finding solutions within this process. Dr. Alistair Bath, a professor in human dimensions of wildlife and an expert in conflict resolution, was hired to facilitate this working group. Now, prior to this Dall sheep working group, Dr. Bath, with 25 plus years of experience, had a 100% success rate working as a facilitator for conflict resolution on conservation issues, as an example of which included such extremes as bringing Palestinians and Israeli authorities together working on urban biodiversity issues. Unfortunately, his perfect record of finding consensus came to an end with this sheep working group. Now, some recent changes that have been enacted in the state. In the calendar year of 2017, the legislature agreed to a license tag fee increase. In the regulatory year of 2016, the board established a bag limit of 1 sheep every 4 years for all non-resident sheep hunters. This applied to all hunts, drawing, registration, and general season harvest tickets. In regulatory 15, the board set restrictions on the use of aircraft statewide from August 10th through September 20th. Aircraft may only be used to place hunters in camps, maintain existing camps, and salvage meat and trophies while used for the purpose of Dall sheep hunting. Aircraft may not be used to spot or locate Dall sheep during the open season. Also, in regulatory year 2015, the board permanently closed all hunting seasons for both residents and non-residents and Game Management Units 23 and Game Management Unit 26A west of the Iktivlik River drainage. This closure was enacted after a public process and concerns about low sheep numbers. Western Brook sheep are unique in that it is at the edge of suitable habitat and historically susceptible to stochastic weather events. And interestingly, the low numbers of sheep counted recently in Game Management Unit 23 are similar to those reported by Scott in 1951. And regulatory year 2008 was the first year Game Management Unit 13D and Game Management Unit 14A south and east of the Matanuska River began to operate under a draw permit system. Now, to give some background on this closure, in 2003, the Ram Mountain paper that was authored by Coltman et al. Was published. Now, this publication poured gasoline on the long debate on the potential effects of selective harvest on sheep. To kind of go into this paper, Ram Mountain is a small isolated population of bighorn sheep with a long history of being studied. So the conclusions of this paper, with over 30 years of harvest of taking nearly every legal ram each and every year, that we're evolutionarily favoring the slower growing rams. That is, it was taking longer for sheep to become legal. Now, so with concerns, so after this paper, concerns about changes in the genetic structure within the Chugach population was one of the arguments for changing the hunt structure from general season harvest ticket to a drawing. Now, since the 2003 Coltman paper, other research suggests that changes in horn growth are better explained by demographic, nutritional, and environmental factors. And one other point I'd like to make, that over the course of that 30-year study in the Ram Mountain, even with them harvesting all legal rams during that period, during the course of that 30-year period, they doubled that small sheep population. Now, nonetheless, concerns about genetic changes, low populations, and the speculation that we are harvesting nearly all legal rams each year led to changing portions of 13D and 14A to a draw hunt season. Now, success rates did not change after we implemented the draw system. However, age structure, due to the any ram permits available, included more young rams in the harvest since the 2008. Further, the age structure of the harvest prior to the implementation of the draw hunt suggests that on average, 52% of the harvested rams were 9 years old or older. Now, please remember this point when we talk about age structure of the harvest and horn morphometrics later in the talk. And lastly, we have no evidence of population growth after the implementation of a closure in Game Management Unit 23 or in portions of the Chugach that went to a draw system. So as Joe talked about before, we've talked previously that population declines and population cycles have occurred. And I want to give a more contemporary example that was observed in Game Management Unit 20A. Now, 20A, it lies in the Alaska Range south of Fairbanks. It's one of our better studied sheep populations. Some of my predecessors, Wayne Heimer did his observational work at the Dry Creek Lick, and later Steve Arthur was looking at lamb mortality and pred-prey interactions within the Central Alaska Range. Now, in this figure, I'm using harvest as a crude measure of population size. On the y-axis, so we have total harvest, and on the y-axis, we have year. Now, during this course of time, we have an evolution of more strict minimum curl standards. So we've evolved from a 3/4 curl harvest to a 7/8 curl harvest to our current hunt strategy of a full curl hunt strategy or full curl harvest strategy. This is general season, 42-day season, and has been. We were on a slight increasing trend until about the winter of 1992 and 1993, where we had severe and heavy rainfall, and we experienced a steep decline in the population. Now, while the population remained low for a period of about 8 years, we steadily increased up to about pre-harvest levels, peaking in about 2016 to our current low numbers of where we are now. Now, although it took on the order of 15 to 20 years to rebuild the sheep populations and harvest returned to pre-decline levels, and this was without any changes in the hunt strategy. The last slide before I turn it back over to Dr. Loheis, I want to give make a little lemonade out of the lemons that we're giving. I want to point out, this is just a figure looking at horn size over the last 30 plus years. And after that crash that we experienced in 1992 and 93, the largest sheep that we recorded were in those low density years in 1995, 96, 97, 98. So it gives more support of the influence of density and nutrition on horn development. And with that, I'm going to turn the talk back over to, oh, I'm sorry, I have another slide. Okay, I'm not quite there. Okay, in this figure, we're just going to look at total statewide harvest from 1977 to present, 2022. What I want to point out, from the time period of 1980 to 2000, we were averaging just about 3,100 hunters a field a year. Now, from that time period of 2001 to 2020, that number has dropped to about 2,552. The 2022 estimate is just an estimate. It's a projected estimate based on the historical reporting rates, so it's subject to change. But this year we're down to, we think we're going to have about 1,780 hunters a field, which may be evidence of hunters self-regulating when they perceive the populations to be low. And my last figure for this point of the time, this simply shows on the x-axis is the total number of hunters a field, and on the y-axis, the total number of hunters. And it shows there is some sort of positive relationship about the effort going on and the overall sheep that are harvested each year. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Loheis. There you go.
Thanks for the historical view, Brad. Members of the board, Mr. Chairman, before we start looking closely at some unit-specific survey and inventory data, some population data, I want to take a little bit deeper dive into some statewide trends over the last 20 years. So let's take a closer look starting in the year 2000. The total number of sheep hunters, both resident and non-resident, are represented in this plot by vertical bars. As Brad pointed out in his historical overview, hunter numbers broadly track sheep abundance. There's been a slight decline over the last 20 or so years, and then a sharper decline over the last 3. Now, remember that there is a 30-day sealing requirement in place for harvest ticket sheep hunts. So that asterisk here over the 2022 column indicates that data is just an estimate of total hunter participation. We usually don't have complete harvest data compiled, hunter effort data, and success rates until about December. Reports come in late. So we just asked our data management shop to extrapolate total participation for this year. So please keep in mind that this is an estimate right around 1790 to 1800 hunters, and this data might change as additional hunters report and or sheep come in for sealing. Now let's take a closer look at the difference in hunter participation between residents. Excuse me a minute. It looked like our internet connection kicked off. Do you guys still have the screen visible? Do you still?
No,
Okay, I'm going to have to exit for just a second here. Bear with me while I restart the PowerPoint presentation. Make it bigger. Share screen. Thank you. All right. Okay, looks like we're moving again. Chairman Burnett, can you see the presentation now, or are we still having some technical issues with our internet connection here in Anchorage?
The screen is up just fine right now. It's the resident.
Real good, thanks.
Non-resident screen.
Okay, so non-resident participation shown in gray has been essentially constant for the last 21 years. Resident hunter numbers, however, have declined. Those numbers are shown in black. They've slowly declined over that time period. Again, we're only going to show data through 2021. We don't have complete data for hunter participation in the 22 season. And while we were comfortable estimating total numbers, we didn't want to extrapolate the non-resident resident breakdown for 2022. So this slide shows statewide harvest levels and how that breaks down between residents and non-residents. The overall height of the column represents the total sheep harvest statewide each year. The lighter shade at the bottom depicts non-resident hunter harvest. Residents are shown by the darker portion above that. Overall total harvest remains stable and was roughly 700 to 800 sheep from the year 2000 until 2019. 2020, those numbers started to drop, and we had a total harvest of 620 animals, down from a long-term average of 700 to 800. In 2019, the total harvest was 2020, total harvest was 627 animals. In 2021, 487, and we've had 418 harvested so far in 2022. Looking a little bit more closely at the resident average, the long-term average from 2000 to 2019 was 494 animals, which dropped in 2020 to 376, and then dropped again in 2021 to 282. And currently, we're sitting on 249 resident harvested sheep as of data that we pulled on October 6th of this year. Again, that number might change as some late harvested sheep come in with a 30-day reporting and sealing requirement. Overall, long-term non-resident harvest between 2000 and 2019 sat right at 300-ish animals, with 316 animals. And then in 2020, that declined slightly to 243. 21. In 2021, there were 203 sheep harvested by non-residents. And in 2022, so far, there have been 149. This line graph shows exactly the same data we just looked at, but allows you to see that the decline was similar between both resident harvest and non-resident harvest. Again, residents are shown in black, non-residents shown in gray, and total harvest levels shown in red. Statewide success rates have likewise declined. Again, residents in black hovering right around 20% over the long term, dropping a little bit below that in 2020, 2021. Non-resident success hovering right around 60 to 65% has likewise declined slightly below that over the last couple of years. Now, ADF&G has not historically recorded sublegal take statewide, although some individual offices have been keeping track. And our best estimates suggest that after compulsory sealing began in 2005 through about 2015, roughly 8 to 10% of the sheep submitted for sealing were sublegal. Between 2015 and 2019, roughly 3 to 4% of those animals were sublegal. I think we can attribute a lot of that decrease to increased education. During that time, Joe Want specifically took some time to develop and distribute a very, very effective talk on how to determine sheep legality. And the department also published a booklet for hunters to use to refer back to. This year, sealing personnel in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Palmer all kept very close track of sublegal harvest. And 26 out of 315 animals, or 8.2% of the sheep sealed by those three offices, were sublegal. 11 of those 26 were submitted by guided hunters. 14 of the 26 were harvested by residents, and one animal we know of was taken by a second degree of kindred non-resident. Of course, some sheep are sealed in outlying offices, so we don't have data on all 418 from this year. But I think the three largest offices give us a pretty reasonable cross-section of what we're seeing in the state for sublegal animals. Anecdotally, from discussions with sealing personnel, most hunters that shot sublegal sheep reported that they were trying to harvest based on age, with a smaller number of hunters not properly assessing full curl. Only rarely we have a hunter report that they shot the wrong ram by mistake. One individual this year here in Anchorage came in and said, it happened, a group of rams ran behind a little ridge, and they came out and I shot the first ram and it was the wrong one. But more often than not, it's from hunters not taking the time to properly assess legality in one fashion or another. Just as an aside, the ram in this photo was shot by a guided hunter. The report from that hunter was that his guide maintained that it was a 9-year-old ram, and we aged this ram at 7 years old here in the Anchorage office. You can see lamb tip followed by 6 annuli on the horn, very clear 7-year-old. Now, we'll look a little bit more closely at sheep populations and trajectories, and I will present some data from summer surveys that our staff put an awful lot of effort into over the last several years, and specifically this summer. But I want to point out that sheep populations aren't limited just to one mountain range in the state. So this presentation is going to highlight data from a latitudinal range of game management units. All of what we'll present today are managed by General Harvest, and we're just trying to show a more complete picture of the situation. Again, the department has asked the area biologists in offices that manage sheep to be available for this talk in the event that the board has specific questions about this data. And also, please don't assume because we do not highlight an area officer at game management GMU, excuse me, please don't assume that if we don't highlight an area office or a game management unit or a mountain range in this talk, that we don't have specific data for it. We were limited a little bit by time and just wanted to present a statewide picture. If the board has specific questions, please ask. We'll refer your question to the area manager who should be on this call. And before we dive in, it's important to really understand the limitations of this data. First off, over the long term, sheep have traditionally taken a lower priority for surveys than moose and caribou. In some years, budgets haven't been strong enough to support all surveys for all three species. Other years, other work takes a priority, or weather has simply kept staff from flying surveys. So we're not always able to complete every survey every year. And additionally, a lot of area offices are responsible for a large geographic area, and we can only fly so many areas in a given time after snow off and before the hunting season starts. So in years that we were able to fly, we had weather and we had money, we did get some data, there are still some limitations to this. First off, the data is imperfect, it's incomplete. Most traditional count areas are small relative to the geographic area of an entire game management unit. Remember too, staff are just performing a minimum count. The data is not corrected for snow cover, for shadows, for sun angle, observer experience, or any one of a number of things that can affect how many animals we're able to see and we're able to count. Also, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between yearling rams and adult ewes from the air. And in many cases, those young rams don't leave ewe groups until they're at least a couple years old. Those animals are all classified as ewe-likes. So we're presenting ewe-likes rather than an absolute number of ewes. Finally, it can be very difficult to see and assess lamb tips from the air. So the number of rams classified as legal is probably a bit on the conservative side. Taken as a whole, this means that summer survey data should be used as a very broad scale index of the population status and not just an absolute count of every single animal in the unit. But we do assume that what we see is a representative slice of the population. For example, lamb numbers in one year can be compared to lamb numbers in another. Also, keep in mind that we're presenting absolute numbers here, not ratios or proportions. So we might see a smaller slice of the population. Those numbers might be quite a bit lower than what you expect over the geographic extent of an entire game management unit. But for what it's worth, and we'll talk about this in detail later in the presentation, we do think that summer surveys are give us a pretty good picture of what's actually happening with the population despite all these caveats. So this slide is going to show the range of survey units that we'll focus on in our talk today. Larger game management units are outlined in red with numbers highlighted. Count areas within those game management units are shown in yellow. We'll start in the Central Brooks Range, speak a little bit of a survey area, primarily in Game Management Unit 24A. It overlaps a little bit into 25A, then move south to Game Management Unit 20A in the Central Alaska Range, south of Fairbanks. We'll present data from the Western Alaska Range in Game Management Unit 19C, and then shift to South Central and look a little bit more closely at two survey units in the Talkeetna Mountains, managed out of the Palmer office in Game Management Unit 13A and 14A. Again, I want to reiterate that just because we're not highlighting an area office or a game management unit or a mountain range in this talk, don't assume we don't have data for it. If the board has questions about a unit, please let us know. We'll refer questions to the area managers on this call. So starting in the Brooks, there are two count areas in the Central Brooks Range, again, mostly in Game Management Unit 24A. These areas are just east of the Hall Road, right here, north and east of Coldfoot, and they extend about as far to the east as Chandelar Lake. First thing I want to present in each snapshot is general harvest trends. We'll look at that, the breakdown between residents and non-residents in each of those units. And then we'll move we'll move to a closer look at what our summer survey efforts have told us about the overpopulation and what that's doing. So for this discussion, we pooled data from Game Management Units 24A and 25A, since the survey area encompasses parts of both. Between 2000 and 2019, non-residents harvested an average of 39 sheep per year out of these two units. In 2020, that number actually climbed a little bit, then the long-term average was 42. And then in 2021, 32 sheep were harvested and declined to 20 animals harvested and sealed by non-residents for the 2022 season. Again, as with previous graphs, non-resident hunter effort is shown in gray, resident effort, and harvest is shown in black. Between 2000 and 2019, residents also harvested an average of 39 sheep in each year. In 2020, that number was a little bit smaller than the long-term average at 36, declined to 18 animals in 2021, and then 11 harvested and sealed so far from 24A and 25A both for the 2022 season. So this stacked column graph will give us a better look at the population composition, what our summer survey data has looked like in these count areas since 2002 through about the present. All these next population graphs should be in the same format, with ewe-like animals shown in dark gray, lambs shown in a little bit lighter shade, sublegal rams shown in a lighter shade still, and legal rams shown in black. Again, the total height of that column shows the total number of animals counted on each of those surveys. These data indicate that populations in the Central Brooks were largely stable till the winters of 2013 and 2014, and where they experienced a decline, then rebounded slightly, and since have decreased below, but more or less stable level since approximately 2018. A couple of real interesting points here. You see we've had pretty good lamb crops from 2000, from surveys, pretty good lamb crops counted in surveys in 2002 through 2009, 2012, but there was essentially no lambs counted in surveys in 2014. Now, also note the number of legal rams shown in black available for harvest in 2021 and 2022. This is due in part to these low lamb numbers in the 2014 count. Those animals would have been 8 years old in 2022. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into those lambs. This slide just shows the numbers of lambs counted. We're not looking at the rest of the population, but it's just intended to highlight that the low harvest in 2022 is partly explained by this low lamb crop in 2014. Remember too that these animals were subject to recent hard winters in 2019 to 20, 2020, 21, and 2022. Now, going forward, I want to point out that the number of lambs counted in surveys in 2021 and 22 are both lower than any previous lamb counts, except for 2014. Of course, some of that variability will be explained by lower absolute numbers of adult ewes on the hills. But if you project this forward, it's likely that we'll see some decreased harvest again 8 years down the road from 2021 and 22 lamb crops. Moving a couple hundred miles south to Game Management Unit 20A, in the Central Alaska Range, managed out of the Fairbanks area office. Between 2002 and 2019, non-residents harvest an average of 50 sheep a year out of Game Management Unit 20A. In 2020, that number was a bit lower than the long-term average at 41. Harvest declined between there and 2021, with only 26 sheep harvested by non-residents, and then 23 harvested so far from the 2022 season. Shifting to the resident plot shown in black, residents harvested an average of 40 sheep a year. In 2020, as with non-resident harvest, that number was also lower than the long-term average, with 25 sheep harvested from Game Management Unit 20A by residents in that year, and then decreased to 23 and 14 harvested and sealed so far for the 2022 season. Now, this is an interesting plot, and I like this one because we've got a real good, consistent history of population composition counts that allows us to take a close look at a number of things. Again, the total height of the graph shows the total number of sheep counted in each survey unit. Ewes again in gray, lambs a little bit lighter, sublegal rams and legal rams shown in black. So these data indicate that populations in the Central Alaska Range increased gradually until about 2011, and then remained largely stable even through winters of 2012 and 2013 that affected some other populations. Winter 2014 decreased populations by a far lesser extent than we saw in the Brooks to the north. And immediately after that winter, numbers started to climb again and continued to increase through 2018. Although starting after that, there's been a more substantial decline across all components of the population against across each of the last 3 winters. One thing I want to point out is that the magnitude of the change, the amount of the change in all populations, all segments of the population are roughly equal, with adult rams, sublegal rams, and ewes all declining by about the same amount in each year. Again, note the smaller number of legal rams available for harvest in 2021 and 22 than in previous years. And again, this is due to some low lamb numbers in 2012, 2013, 2014. Those animals would have been 8 and 9 years old. So again, let's take a closer look at that lamb production. Specifically, I wanted to point out that the number of I wanted to point out again that the small lamb crops of 2013 and 2014 contributed to the low harvest in 22. Again, these animals were subject to some recent hard winters, but note specifically that the last 3 years, 2020, 21, and 22, lamb crops here are lower than any previous count since the year 2000. So again, this is due in part to lower absolute numbers of adult ewes on the hill. But if you project these age cohorts forward 8 years, it strongly suggests we're going to see some reduced harvests in 2028 through 2030 as a function of the lamb crops of 2020 to 2022. We'll shift west a little bit and look at some data from the Western Alaska Range, Game Management Unit 19C, managed out of McGrath. Again, the yellow area on the map depicts the minimum count survey area that we use to gather data on this game management unit. And between 2000 and 2019, non-residents harvested an average of 53 sheep a year out of this game management unit. In 2020, that number tracked along with the long-term average right at 53, and then declined to 34 animals harvested by non-residents in 2021. So far in 2022, 24 sheep have been harvested and sealed by non-residents from Game Management Unit 19C this year. Long-term average for residents is a little bit lower, with an average of 25 sheep per year harvested by residents out of Game Management Unit 19C. In 2020, there were 14 sheep harvested by residents, with 6 and then 3 harvested in 2021 and 2022, respectively. Looking at population composition from summer surveys in Game Management Unit 19C, these data suggest that populations in the Western Alaska Range experienced an early decrease somewhere in the 2012 or 2013 timeframe, but then remained largely stable for years until they were affected even further in 2020 and 2021. Now, we'll talk about this again a little bit later in the talk, but we know that there have been several rain on snow events that severely affected sheep populations in the Western Alaska Range. One of our survey pilots with a long history in Game Management Unit 19C reported that 2 to 3 feet of wet, heavy snow, followed by more than an inch of actual rain, fell in late March, the 26th and 27th of March in 2020. Fairbanks residents also remember last year's Christmas storm that dropped right around an inch of actual rain in Fairbanks. And if we look at precipitation data, which from that storm, which we will a little bit later in the talk, we'll see it hit this area just south of McGrath particularly hard as well. So in contrast to the 2 areas we just discussed, where we showed 1 or 2 poor lamb crops, counts from 19C sort of seem to document lower lamb production for several years in a row, starting in 2013, 2014, 2015. These rams would be 9, 8, and 7 years old this year. And again, note the number of legal rams counted in 2022 and presumably available for harvest was influenced both by lamb numbers in 2013, 14, and 15, and then by the rain on snow events in 2020 and 2021. Going into the next 2 years, the lamb crops of 2015 and 2016 are only slightly larger than the 2 previous cohorts of 13 and 14, which are the sheep we're harvesting now. So if you look at the 2022 lamb production, you'll again see it's the lowest in several recent years. Moving into South Central, we'll highlight Game Management Unit 13A in the Eastern Talkeetnas. 4 survey units are typically counted here in the southwest portion of the Game Management Unit. And this, interestingly enough, this survey area has held roughly 2/3 of the GPS radio collars for our disease research project that we started in 2019. And we'll look at that data and how it relates to population counts a little bit later in the talk. Much of Game Management Unit 13A is accessible by road or by wheeled vehicles off of the road. And as a result, most of the hunting pressure comes from Alaska residents. Between 2002 and 2019, non-residents harvested an average of 7 sheep a year out of Game Management Unit 13A. In 2020, that number tracked right along with the long-term average at 7 harvested. There was no non-resident harvest recorded from this Game Management Unit in 2021, and only 2 animals reported harvested by non-residents in 2022 so far. But between 2002 and 2019, residents harvested an average of 20 animals out of Game Management Unit 13A. In the year 2020, 13 harvested, and then 9 and 7 with 2021 and 22 respectively. Summer survey data indicate that populations in the Eastern Talkeetnas were largely stable until the winter of 2019, with good lamb crops as well up until very recently. Again, note the smaller number of sheep in the population after the winter of 2019 and 2020. And we'll look at this and how it relates to some of our radio collar data in a future part of this talk. Recently, lamb numbers have again been, like in a lot of other game management units, lamb numbers have been lower than in previous surveys. Moving west in the Talkeetnas, the final unit we'll take a look at today is Game Management Unit 14A. 2 survey units are typically counted here in the northeast portion of that Game Management Unit. And like 13A, 14A also holds a portion, about 1/3 of the animals for the disease study that we started in 2019. Much like its neighbor to the immediate east, Game Management Unit 14A is accessible from the road system. And as a result, most of the hunting pressure comes from Alaska residents. Between 2002 and 19, non-residents harvested an average of only 3 sheep a year out of 14A. Non-resident harvest was not reported in 2020, and then in 21, 3 animals and 1 more in 2022. Between 2002 and 2019, residents harvested an average of 4 sheep a year. In 2020, 1 harvested by a resident, 3 and then 2 harvested in 2021 and 22 respectively. And survey data indicate that populations here have been largely stable, although the numbers of legal rams available for harvest has declined slightly in the last couple of surveys. Lamb production appears to have had some lean years recently, but it's also offset by normal or better than average lamb production in some recent lamb crops. So in summary, what do we see across the state? Most areas, the Brooks, the Western Alaska Range, Central Alaska Range, the TMA and the Eastern Alaska Range, the Talkeetnas, the northern part of the Chugach, have all experienced between a 50 and 70% decline. We are seeing low harvests in most game management units as a function of lamb crops, and some are all the years between 2012 and 2014. And remember that sheep born in those years were affected by recent winter conditions that gave us higher adult mortality between 2020 and 2022, further decreasing populations and decreasing the number of prime-aged animals that would contribute to the population as well as potentially be available for harvest if they were rams. It bears repeating that in many of these survey units, number of lambs counted in 2020, 21, and 22 are lower than previous counts since the year 2000. And in most cases, these lamb crops are even lower than what we counted in 2013 and 2014. It's important to point out that if we project these age cohorts forward, it suggests we'll see some reduced harvests as a function of these lower lamb crops. In all likelihood, we'll be right back here in a few years. I want to also take a moment and compare all these areas that we have harvested, most of them under general harvest ticket, general hunts, harvest ticket regulations, and point out that the declines in these areas are mirrored by declines in unhunted hard park populations or populations that are only eligible for harvest by subsistence hunters. Park Service data from our colleagues with the National Park Service and published in their annual survey memos for Denali and Wrangell St. Elias National Parks, and from their Arctic Network resource brief published in December 2020, indicate that several park units are down by 50 to 70% as well. Denali National Park estimates put the sheep population there down by about 50%. Northeast Gates of the Arctic down by about 60%. South Central Brooks down by 40 to 70%. And they do note that the Wrangell St. Elias was stable until 2019, but there have not been, to the best of my knowledge, counts there by either our staff or National Park Service staff since summer of 2019. With that, I'll take a moment to catch my breath and turn the screen back over to Brad Wendling. Brad will talk about some research that he's been doing, looking at horn morphometrics and how that will be used as a management tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I know that was a lot of information to pass on. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and go on to some of the current research work that's going on within our department throughout the state. As I moved positions within the department, I accepted the sheep researcher job in 2015. My first project was assessing Dall sheep horn morphometrics as a management tool. And I'd like to point out that this was a collaboration across the state where my colleagues Joe Want and Chris Brockman out of the Palmer office, a whole slew of technicians, Kyle and Tom Lohais. But the real big shout out goes to all the sheep hunters that when they brought their sheep in for sealing, that allowed us to collect some more detailed measurements than we had in the past. I talked about the Ram Mountain paper earlier in this talk, and the Canadians were way ahead of us at this point in time. At the time of their sealing, they have 30, 40 plus year data sets where during their compulsory sealing that they were collecting more information than we were. In particular, they were collecting a lot of detailed measurements of the distance between annulus, and were able to run some analyses from that. So my objective when we came in there, when we first started compulsory sealing, the only information we would have would be an age estimate, total length, and a basal circumference. So we wanted to start to collect additional data at the time of sealing, specifically mimic our Canadian counterparts and measure that distance between annuli. But something unique that we wanted to try to do was actually quantify the degree of curl for each horn. Now, with that information, we wanted to examine the relationship between the horn degree of curl and the age. We wanted to look at the relationship between the horn degree of curl and the total horn length. And lastly, what we wanted to try to do, because another impetus for this research project was we often heard prior to having this sort of data, we're shooting all these sheep as soon as they become legal, or we're changing the genetic structure of sheep and it takes them a long time to become full curl. So one of the things we wanted to look at is we wanted to estimate the proportion of rams harvested that would have been legally available for harvest in previous hunting seasons based on our 360 degree of curl requirement. So we started collecting this data in 2016, and we've gone through this current year. I'm only showing data between 2016 and 2021, but we measured and photographed during the 2016 through 2021, measured and photographed 2,057 rams that were harvested statewide. And this was about approximately 60% of the harvested sheep each year. We only did this in the big three offices, the Anchorage, Palmer, and Fairbanks office, because the bulk of the sheep are sealed there. And you know, our satellite offices we're better staffed. Our satellite offices, you know, they're spread a little thin. We did not collect any data in 2020 because of the COVID outbreak. And so, not to get deep in the methods, but we've dusted off our 8th grade geometry textbooks. So we used central angle theorem and a circumscribed angle theorem to actually quantify the degree of curl from the photographs that we took from the horns. So for our data set, we quantified the age, we quantified the total horn length, we quantified the degree of curl, we measured the length between the annulus segments, and then we had the degree of curl by annulus segments. Now I want to point out our predecessors, some of the early sheep biologists back in 1968 through 1970 had gone around through taxidermy shops. This is at a time we were predominantly under 3/4 curl harvest, and made these same sort of measurements. So we have a data set going back 1968 to 70 that we can make some comparisons to, and they had measured about 527 rams. So this illustration just kind of depicts the kind of data that we have for each horn. So just to point out, if you can see my cursor at that 2-year annulus, this sheep has grown 223 millimeters. It's 2 years old, and it's 106 degrees of curl. So as it grows at the 3-year annulus, it's 403 millimeters. Sorry, we're in metric, and I can't convert in my head because I'm American. But and it's 193 degrees of curl, and so on and so forth. So this ram grew into 360 degree curl in its 6th year of life, and as you can see, it made it through 2 previous hunting seasons based on being full curl. So I'm just going to kind of go right into the results, and we're going to start off by looking at the age structure of our predecessors' data set, the 1968 to 1970 data set. Again, this is when we're under 3/4 curl harvest strategy. And as you can see, this harvest is spread out over a wider age class, with the bulk of the harvest happening between those 4- and 8-year-old rams. So the histogram on the left is the one I just showed you, where we're under 3/4 curl harvest strategy. And the histogram on the right is the data that we've been collecting since 2016, predominantly under a full curl harvest strategy. As you'd expect, it takes longer for a sheep to grow into full curl. And so as we can see, we've shifted our harvest to an older segment of the population, with the bulk of the harvest happen between those 7 and 10-year-olds, with the, you know, peaking at the 8 and 9-year-old rams. So the most interesting result is depicted in this graph, and this is going to be an illustrative to go through it the first time. This is just a 2016 data, and it's the statewide, and it's pooled for all mountain ranges statewide for what we had measured. So what we're looking at is the percentage of Dall sheep harvest as a function of the number of seasons they were legal to be harvested under the full curl regulation. So you're going to see this graph in several more series, but like I said, just to explain it in detail. So what column 0 represents is in 2016, 19% of those rams were legally harvested on criteria other than being 360 degrees of curl. So what that means, they made it on age, but not full curl, or they made it by being both lamb tips missing or double broomed, or potentially they were harvested in one of our limited any ram hunts. Now, column 1 represents, these are sheep that were harvested that the first year that they grew into 360 degrees of curl. So that summer they're on the landscape, their horns grew through 360, and they were taken the first year that they were available. Okay, so then we go into column 2. So 37% of the rams that we had measured in 2016 have made it through one previous hunting season based on being 360 degrees of curl. So I'm using a term escapement here, and I want to point out that this is not any term that we have management objectives or any sort. It's something that this researcher shamelessly stole from our our sheep counterparts I'm using to illustrate this point, like how many sheep are making it through a previous hunting season. So when I go into column 3, these sheep, 14%, had made it through 2 previous hunting seasons based on being legal based on 360 degrees accrual before they're harvested, and so on and so on. So what this means in that 2016 data set, 57% of the rams that we harvested had on a statewide level, on a broad statewide level, were legally available for harvest based on 360 degrees accrual at least 1 previous hunting season. I want to slow down here, and I need to get better expressing this point. This does not mean that we're only taking 43% of our rams. This is all of the sheep harvested. I have no way to account for any of the sheep that had died, legal sheep that had died of any natural causes. So when we combine all those years together, again, this is busy, 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 21, that histogram's in the same format, we see a strikingly similar pattern. And what we see for those 5 years, that the sheep that had made it through at least 1 previous hunting season based on a statewide level of all our mountain ranges where we have hunting, that range, or the term I'm using as escapement, was between 57 and 66% for that given year, for those years. Now I'm going to shift. How can we look at this data in a finer scale? And I'm going to focus, since I'm a Fairbanks guy and I'm based out of Region 3, we're going to focus on Region 3 areas. And Region 3, most of our areas are open to general season, 42-day hunts, with the exception of a few draw areas. And typically about 70% of our statewide harvest comes out of Region 3. So let's focus there. Now, again, so to kind of show the differences in this histogram that I'm circling in the upper left corner is just a 2017 data set that is comparing what I'm calling a escapement of the 2 extremes in Game Management Unit 20A and Game Management Unit 12. So in Game Management Unit 20A in 2017, 46% of the rams that we had measured had been legally available for at least 1 previous hunting season, compared to the far end of it, in Game Management Unit 12, 67% of the sheep that came in, we measured, were legally available for at least 1 previous hunting season. So I can drop down here in those big 4 areas, Game Management Unit 20A, 19C, and 12, and the Brooks Range. We can see typically, a heavy used area like 20A has the lowest, what I'm calling escapement, again, not a term that we use for management objectives, but has the lowest. About 41 to 53% of those rams were legally, once they were harvested, were legally available 1 previous hunting season. And the other 3 areas are real similar, high 50s up to the low 80s of escapement rates. So kind of in conclusion, a lot of the past research examining the effects of selective harvest on mountain sheep has focused primarily on the growth rates, that is the total segment length, growth segments, and horn volume, while the vast majority of North American sheep hunting harvest strategies are based on some sort of defined minimum degree accrual. Now, our results show substantial variation. I didn't show you these results, but I can happy to do it another time. But we show substantial variation of the degree accrual for both ram age and horn length. And furthermore, we demonstrate that between 2016 and 2021, under predominantly full accrual hunting strategy, between 57 and 60% of harvested rams were available for harvest at least 1 hunting season after attaining their 360 degrees accrual. And with that, I'm going to shift it back to Tom he can talk about his Chugach research.
All right, so we'll shift gears, and this is a little bit more comfortable for me. I'm on my home ground here talking about some stuff that I'm a little bit more familiar with rather than some some of the work done by my colleagues. I'm a little uncomfortable presenting their hard work. Please understand I'm not taking credit for it, that they deserve the kudos for getting in the back of the Super Cub and getting that flying done over the course of the last several months and several years. But talking about the work that we've done in the Chugach, again, this has been very much a collaborative project. Colleagues here in Anchorage and in Fairbanks, and area biologists and assistant area biologists in offices from Glen Allen to Palmer to Kenai, Homer have all helped out with this and all contributed, and it couldn't have been done without them. But we started this work in Game Management Unit 13D in the North Central Chugach in 2009 in response to concerns about decreased populations. We knew that rams and ewes had both declined at about the same rate, but we didn't know why. All we knew is that we were sitting on about a 30 to 50% decline, even in 2009 from previous highs. We started a very broad-based look at things that might influence sheep population. We were asking questions about what was killing adults, predation, overall animal health, disease, starvation, avalanches. We looked closely at lamb production, pregnancy rates, and recruitment, the number of young animals that are entering the population. So we started capturing animals in March 2009 by helicopter net gunning, and then radio collaring them, taking samples and following them for several years to determine their fate. After we'd built some baseline data in the northern Chugach, we expanded our work into Game Management Unit 14C, closer to Anchorage. That population had also declined substantially in the early 2000s and was stable at that point, but not really increasing at any rate when we started work. This photo shows Kyle Smith, my colleague, my coworker, my conscience, essentially, in helicopter pilot Troy Cambier, recapturing a previously collared ewe in Peters Creek. This just kind of shows you what we get to do when we're out in the field. The left-hand picture shows us taking blood samples from a 13D ewe. This is wildlife technician Mike Harrington here. Blood samples are used to assess pregnancy rates, assess individual and population disease status, measure trace mineral levels, and look at overall health. We're running essentially the same blood counts and blood chemistry measures you get when you go to your doctor for a physical. In the photo on the right, we're using an ultrasound to measure body fat and muscle deposits. So the first red flag we noticed when we started handling animals in 2009 was that these critters were really, really skinny, even for ungulates in late winter. The first animals we got out of the helicopter on, you run your hand down their spine, you could identify every single bony process across the back. The withers, the spine, the hips, the nuchal ligament, that big ligament that connects the back of the head to the shoulders. You know, if you've ever field dressed an animal, you know that that's right there. You've got to slice the neck meat and the top end of the back straps off of that. That thing was completely and totally exposed. You could pinch that ligament and your fingers would meet underneath it on most animals. They were so skinny. So the second piece of information that we used to build the picture, to put the puzzle together, if you will, was when we got our pregnancy data back from the lab. In most healthy ungulate populations, pregnancy rates are somewhere between 85 and 100% every year. This is supported by data on moose and caribou, specifically in sheep. Steve Arthur's work in the Alaska range in 2003 had pregnancy rates in this area. And Mary Wood, a colleague who worked on British Columbia Stones sheep, a thin-horned close cousin to Dall's, reported a 95% pregnancy rate over 5 years in her study population. That first year, 62% of our ewes were pregnant, which seemed pretty low. Those first couple of years in 13D, numbers fluctuated a bit, but were lower than where I thought that they should be and what we'd expect to see. Then we got a really unpleasant surprise in 2012. Only 21% of our ewes were pregnant. That same year, we reported, it was the first year we worked in 14C, and we reported a 44% pregnancy rate in the Western Chugach. There's a couple things that are worth noting here. The first is, if you remember that winter of 2011, 2012 brought record snow depths to South Central. Second, remember that the 13D portion of the Chugach went to drawing hunts in 2008. Presumably, if low ram abundance was driving low pregnancy rates, we would have expected to see some sort of a gradual increase in pregnancy rates as drawing hunts brought some lower harvest levels to those areas and protected some mature rams. We did not see that. Now, if you look at this data over time and across study areas, you will see that while 14C seems to produce higher pregnancy rates on average than 13D, there's still some variability in there with a couple of real low years, and more recently in 2020, 2022. Just as an aside, extremely high avalanche danger in 2021 kept us from catching a sufficient data size, the sample size, to make an informed estimate. So we don't have data for 2021. And we'll look a little bit closer at this data and what it might mean at the population level in a moment. Along with 14C ewes in the Talkeetnas have experienced 2 years of really low pregnancy rates out of the last 4. So we tracked our radio collared adults very closely for several years. Initially, we were putting VHF radio collars on them. We had to fly these animals every 10 days to 2 weeks to make sure they were still alive. We're still tracking them, although now we're using GPS collars. The original VHF collars gave off a mortality signal when the animal stopped moving for more than 4 hours. So we'd get a mortality signal, we'd go in a helicopter and try to determine the cause of death, do a necropsy on that animal if we had to. Now with the satellite collars, we just get an email, but the way we handle it is the same. We try to get in there as quickly as we can and ascertain what's killed that animal. Anytime there was evidence of a predator at a kill site, we credited the predator with that mortality. It's usually pretty easy to see when we had a predation event. Blood shows up well on white fur, and you could almost always find blood, bone scatter, chew marks on the collar from a wolf kill here in 13D in this rightmost picture. This might have caused us to slightly overestimate our predation rates, but I don't expect that it was all that great an overestimate. We also found a substantial number of intact carcasses, like this one in the top center picture. We recovered this animal for later necropsy and found out that she had died as a result of a uterine infection that went septic while she was pregnant. On other times, it was pretty easy to figure out what had killed them, but really hard to get that collar back. After digging out a couple of radio collars from avalanche debris piles, we just let summer weather do the work for us and started recovering avalanche kills after the hunting season in September. Overall, adult survival rates through between 2009 and 2017 were right at 88% in both study areas of the Chugach. And this is in line with what we've seen in other sheep populations. But where the story gets interesting is that only a small fraction of the adults in the Chugach project were killed by predators. Wolves, bears, and wolverines all killed adults, but these deaths occurred at a lower rate than those we saw by avalanches, pneumonia, starvation, other factors. Just for some comparison, Steve Arthur's work in the Alaska Range in the 1990s and early 2000s showed that predators were responsible for all the adult mortality that he recorded. So there's a big difference in what shapes sheep populations in different mountain ranges. We also captured and radio collared 133 lambs between both study areas over the course of the project. These newborns were radio collared and tracked for a year. Again, like the adults, anytime their collar gave off a mortality signal, we'd get in as quickly as we can to try to determine the cause of mortality. The take-home message here, and we can do a deep dive into the rates and causes of mortality in another presentation at another time. But the take-home message from 133 lambs collared and tracked for several years was that about 30% of lambs survived, 30% were killed by predators, and 30% were lost to accidents and other causes. It was interesting. We found that each predator has a very characteristic signature. And the nice thing again about white fur is you can tell when a predator has been there. This animal in the upper right-hand picture was killed by a golden eagle. Eagles would tend to consume the soft tissue, but leave the long bones intact. Every once in a while, they'd break into the brain case, but that was not usual. Photo in the bottom right shows what's left after a wolverine kill. They'd usually clean it up pretty good, but leave you the long bones and a collar. If you look closely, somewhere in that picture, there's a jawbone, but I can't see it at the moment. Animal on the left, upper, died of pneumonia after as a result of a severe lungworm infection. And of course, a rock slide is one of the accidental deaths we recorded. So let's see. Again, as with adults, predators had a much lower effect on Chugach lambs than other researchers had found in other mountain ranges. Again, Steve Arthur's work in the Alaska and Brooks Range found that coyotes and eagles were the primary source of lamb loss in his 20A study area. And eagles and wolverines were the primary sources of mortality he recorded in Brooks Range sheep populations. Again, different demographic forces at work in different mountain ranges. And before I move forward and discuss some of the conclusions, I want to shift gears for a moment and speak about a second project that we're working on in the Talkeetnas. That'll allow me to talk a little bit about how both projects are tied together and how we're using data from that work in management efforts. This is a necropsy photo from a ewe that died of pneumonia here in Game Management Unit 14C. Her spine is here, the top of the picture. Her head's towards the left side of your viewing screen. You can see clearly here down at the bottom the infected portion of the lung. Note the massive deposit of pus in the lower forwardmost portion, so where pneumonia usually locates. The bumpy area at the top of the lung here is a different issue. This is a sign of a lungworm infestation. It usually affects most sheep to some extent and usually isn't lethal. As an aside, if you're ever hunting and field dressing an animal and you see something like this, we really want samples. Cut something out that encompasses both the infected portion, the margin, and the healthy tissue, stuff it in a Ziploc and bring it back. It's really valuable information that we'd appreciate getting. So we began work in the Talkeetnas in Game Management Unit 13A and 14A in February of 2019. Previous to that, the department had done some disease surveillance on hunter harvested animals, and these nasal swabs, if you had a sheep harvested, if you had a sheep sealed that you harvested in 2016 or 17, we were swabbing nasal passages at that point, and some of those animals had turned up positive for bacteria known as Mycoplasma ovoipneumoniae. If you remember, the center of where we found those animals was Boulder Creek in the Talkeetna Mountains in Game Management Unit 13A. If you've been following sheep news nationwide, you know that some strains of this bacteria are extremely lethal and responsible for large-scale population-level die-offs in bighorn populations in the lower 48. So we wanted, of course, this was a potential big deal. We wanted detailed information on how many sheep might be carrying the bug, how many might have been exposed to it, and what, if any, the long-term effects of this microorganism in our populations were. So we looked at specifically at disease, but we also took this opportunity to look at pregnancy rates, other rates and causes of adult mortality, and how these animals were using their habitat. So we started handling GPS radio collaring and sampling animals in February 2019. We started a collaborative project with doctors Kylie Thacker. This is Kylie here on the left, sampling a Talkeetna Mountains ewe, and Dr. Helen Schwancha. And Kylie and Helen are wildlife veterinarians employed by the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Development, and they work regularly with stone sheep. They're both disease experts, and so we brought them in to help us assess disease presence and prevalence across a wide range of thinhorn populations. So this project is ongoing. We're sampling between 40 and 80 sheep a year as part of this work in the Chugach and the Talkeetnas both. Again, we're using this opportunity to track pregnancy rates, rates and causes of mortality, and how these animals are using habitat through time. Now, we've found that survival of adult animals is variable between mountain ranges and across years. And that's not really in and of itself surprising, but it's valuable information on at least two fronts. First, we've documented that ice layers and avalanche conditions and snowpack that persists late into May kill sheep. And taken in conjunction with our pregnancy rate data we talked about earlier, we show that these issues can also cause low lamb production, which is exactly what we've seen in the Talkeetnas over the last 3 winters. Higher adult mortality, plus low pregnancy rates, leading to lower populations. Interestingly, we overlay our survival data. Remember, I told you we were going to look at how some of this radio collar data lined up with what we're seeing in our summer surveys. It shows us that our summer surveys are probably doing a reasonable job at showing us what's happening with the population. This drop from about 900 animals in 2019 to about 600 coincides with a 34% adult mortality rate that we measured on our collared sample across the course of that winter. And the drop from about 600 down to about 475 between summer 21 and summer 22 also tracks very nicely with the 29% mortality on our college sample this last winter. So we see the same thing with our pregnancy rate data set. In 2019, 92% of our collared animals in the Talkeetnas were pregnant. We had a pretty good lamb crop that year, compared to 33% in 2020 and 60% this last year in 2022. So let's circle back. We found evidence that mycoplasma, as well as a number of other pathogens, are present in our wild sheep populations. The good news is they're present at very low levels. It also appears that these microorganisms are not the most pathogenic variety. We certainly do lose some animals to disease, but usually only in the presence of other stressors, specifically poor nutrition, hard winters, ice layers, things like that. And next, we see far fewer sheep, both adults and lambs, lost to predation in the Chugach than we might expect, and far less of an effect of predation in the Chugach studies than Steve Arthur documented in his Alaska Range work in the late 90s and early in the 2000s. Predation in the Talkeetna project has a slightly greater effect than in the Chugach, but it's still not overwhelming. And we still lose more sheep there to avalanches, accidents, and other causes than we do to predation. So we see that if we take a detailed look at our cause-specific mortality, which we aren't going to get into today, we can do that at another point. We do see that everything with teeth and claws takes a small fraction of the lamb crop, but there really isn't a smoking gun as far as a single predator. It's distributed broadly across eagles, black bears, brown bears, wolves, coyotes. Everything has a small effect on the total lamb crop, but there really isn't a smoking gun as far as a single predator. Given the low levels of predator take and the broad distribution across several predator species, I think it's pretty safe to say that the Chugach populations aren't predation limited. Along those lines, with a low level presence and prevalence of wildlife diseases, I think we can rule out disease as an issue in South Central sheep populations at this point in time. But what we can say is we see skinny animals and we see low pregnancy rates. And it's likely that a habitat issue or a nutritional issue, or in turn, a weather issue that affects those habitat and nutrition factors, is driving sheep populations and driving lamb production, specifically in South Central populations. So we don't know what the future is going to bring, but we do have hard data that shows us that winter conditions in the form of icing events, rain on snow, and avalanches all are responsible for killing sheep. We also know that habitat loss, we also know that alders and brush are moving upslope into the alpine, which could mean a loss of sheep habitat as alpine tundra is overgrown by dwarf birch and willow. And we've just started looking at how growing conditions influence the nutritional content of sheep forage. That data is still in the early stages of analysis, but we can say that the protein content of two important sheep forage types changes due to summer growing conditions. So I want to point out that historic population declines seem to be the result of a single event that might have led to one or two bad winters. For example, the early 1990s decline in 20A was very probably related to 1991's Mount Pinatubo eruption. But by some metrics, specifically measuring mortality rates on our collared animals and looking at our lamb production, current populations have experienced as many as 6 weather events over the last 10 years. And this might be a new paradigm as conditions warm. And it might be that populations will persist, but at a lower density. We're specifically concerned about small, isolated populations that might be islands of sheep, Yukon-Tanana uplands, Glacier Mountain CUA, populations on the Kenai, but we're also very, very concerned about larger populations in the greater ranges. Just a quick look at specific issues that might be related to this. Here on the top right, we see a young ram pushing through deep snow. We saw a lot of this during our capture work in winters 21 and 22. Increased snow depth increases the energetic cost of locomotion, as well as limiting their access to forage. The bottom left graphic shows precipitation amounts from an extreme weather event that hit the west side of the Alaska Range and then pushed north as far as Fairbanks and around Christmas of 2021. In some places, 1 inch to 2 inches of rain fell on top of existing snowpack and then turned to ice. If you look closely, there's a little blip of heavy precipitation right on the western side of the Alaska Range south of McGrath. So this event may well have affected the 19C population as well. I talked about shrubline advancing. Dr. Roman Dall at Alaska Pacific University has used historic aerial photos, and he's documented that brush has moved upslope into sheep habitat, some places as much as 4 feet a year in parts of the Chugach and the Kenais. I shot this picture in Ram Valley in the Chugach, right up above Eagle River and Game Management Unit 14C. You can see dwarf birch growing up into the foreground, and if you look closely, there's a young spruce tree growing through the snow on the right-hand side of the photo. Now, Luke Methrow, one of our department-sponsored graduate students, is at University of Alaska Fairbanks right now. And he spent the last several years living out of a backpack, watching sheep forage, identifying important sheep forage items, and measuring their nutritional protein content. He's found that graminoids, grasses, and forbs, leafy green stuff, which are key summertime diet items for sheep, can have very different protein content in years and under different growing conditions. In this graph, forbs and graminoids are shown by the 2 center groups of columns. Each color represents a different year. And you can see that protein content in those 2 diet items changes each year. That's important because each of those years had slightly different temperature and precipitation characteristics. So right now, Kyle's and my work is focused on answering questions related to habitat, nutrition, snowpack, and foraging. We're looking at ways to measure if we've lost sheep habitat, looking at winter movement, nutrition, and summer nutrition specifically. Our current set of radio collars are designed and programmed to release from study animals this next spring of 2023, and we'll analyze that data and look at where to go from there. I'll turn it back over to Brad, and he can talk about some pending work that he has planned in the Central Brooks Range, and that another department employee, Christy Osborne, has planned in the Western Brooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So Christy Osborne is an area biologist out of the Kotzebue office, and she's been selected by our department to pursue a master's degree. I want to point out this is in the very early stages of experimental design and project development. But she put this slide together for us. We were hoping she could present it, but I'm going to have to do it for her. But so she wants to investigate the factors that are limiting growth of a non-hunted Dall sheep population in northwestern Alaska. She's going to attempt to quantify and identify causes of adult mortality within the Baird and DeLong Mountains and assess mortality rates. Additionally, try to determine the pregnancy and lambing rates, assess the health and body condition, and survey for disease and parasite presence and prevalence. She's going to proposing to track seasonal movements to identify home range and reproductive use areas, and examine the genetic relationships between areas. She's scheduled to start in the fall of 2023, so we look forward to see what she can find out. Now, like I said, I was hired as a sheep researcher, or moved over into the position as sheep researcher in 2015. And in that time, outside of the horn morphometric project, we have been developing a project. So part of the process of developing this project was going through and interviewing all our management biologists to get their what we need to learn, and going into the literature and where are the data gaps. And as Tom had alluded to or told you previously, quite frankly, we on?
Ryan says we're on.
Okay, my apologies, everybody. As the,
Make sure you're sharing screen.
I think we're good. We're sharing.
are we sharing screen now?
Yep.
Yes, we are.
Okay, my apologies. That's the world we live in now. I'm not sure where we left off, but as Tom had alluded to previously, frankly, compared to moose and caribou, the amount of effort that has gone into studying sheep is we lag far behind. So one of the things we want to look at is like, where are the data, after we interviewed all our managers, where are the data gaps? And so within the research, Tom had just shown his research looking at sheep nutrition and some lamb mortality in the Chugach. And we've had lamb mortality studies and some ewe demographic studies, and our counterparts in the Park Service are working on better ways to enumerate sheep with different statistical techniques. And we've had studies looking at the effects of jet aircraft on sheep habitat selection. But a data gap that we have is on the ram ecology, of ram ecology. So it was a 6-year process of developing research questions. I'm going to go through what we were proposing to do. That's not. Broken. Again, my apologies. Ah. Are we good?
No.
Brad or Tom, is there anything that board support staff can help you with? Oh,
I don't think so. I think
I-
we've got internet connectivity issues.
All right, we're there. There's not a lot of slides here. We're nearing the end here. So why does the department need this research? So Val Geis is a prominent sheep biologist, wrote the book Mountain Sheep. Anyway, so in his 1971 work, he postulated the dominance mortality hypothesis. And why that is that male survivorship is lower because of the stress of the rut. So therefore, there's a question through our hunting system, by removing large males, are we increasing the mortality of the immature rams if they start increasing if all of a sudden, because removing these large rams, are these younger rams participating at a younger age, is their mortality accelerated? So this hypothesis has not been rigorously tested. Ed Murphy, a former professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, actually did some comparative work in the 1990s where they were looking at age structure of rams in a hunted and unhunted area, and they didn't really see a lot of difference. But they did say in this 30-plus-year-old study that this hypothesis deserves some more study. So, the effects of the selective harvest are not clear or settled. So the purpose of our research is to examine the potential of impacts of fulcral harvest in the short term. What does that mean for energetics and the overwinter survival of these rams? And the long term, what are the genetic ramifications and what potential effects are there on population dynamics and overall fitness? Now for the experimental design, like I said, it's a long process. We've secured funding for a 3-year study, but if things go well, what we really learn with our other species when we have a long-term data set. So we're hoping to get this started and learn something, ideally that it turns into something a little bit more long-term. So what we wanted, or what we're using, is 2 study areas with varying harvest intensity. And one thing that we have in this state that we can use to our benefit from an experimental approach is we have these vast areas of national parks that are essentially closed to hunting that we can use as a control. So the idea was to both GPS mark and get a genetic mark of subfulcral rams and follow those rams through the course of their life. Now, additionally, we want to intensively get genetic samples or DNA samples from both lambs and or yearlings. And at the time of compulsory sealing, we're able to pull a piece of muscle tissue off and get a genetic signature there as well. So our initial study area, this is just a broad view. I think my cursor went away, but a broad view of the Alaska range. I just want to point out the polygon, the green, is our gates of the Arctic National Park, which is essentially closed with exception of some minimal subsistence hunting for federally qualified folks. We talked about the closure in Game Management Unit 23 to the west. Out to the east, this polygon represents the Arctic Village Sheep Management Area, which is also closed to those except that are federally qualified. But this red polygon is where we do our minimum count survey, and we have data going back to about 2002. So it makes sense that we would use that as an area. And I also want to point out along the Hall Road that we're weapons restricted within 5 miles of either side. So it's bow and arrow only, and it's non-motorized. So if you want to hike back in there, you strap your backpack on and start walking. So that's the setup. So to go into a little bit finer detail, the blue polygon on the left, that is going to be our control. This is our control study area. So we have hunted, open season, both residents and non-residents. And then right across the road in the hard park, we have a control. So treatment of the hunted, control of the unhunted area. So the research questions that we have are, under a full curl harvest strategy, one, are the horn lengths and body sizes smaller in areas of the heavy hunting pressure? Also, our second question, is the survival of those 3 to 8 year old rams lower in the areas that we have the hunting pressure? And lastly, we want to look at what is the reproductive contribution of these immature males, rams, and the heavy and the lightly harvested systems. Now, through this research, we hope to get a better understanding of the survivorship curves of different ram cohorts, a better understanding of the reproductive contribution of the sub-full curl rams. We will get some baseline data on ram ecology that we don't have, such as home range size, movement rates, dispersal and habitat selection. We'll be able to monitor the overall herd health and continue to monitor any disease presence or prevalence, get an idea of group size dynamics. And then we'll also, with the use of our marked animals, try to develop some citability indexes so we can improve our minimum count surveys. Now, we launched this project in June of this year. We're doing a proof of concept to go out and try to get fecal material from lambs on the landscape so we could get that initial genetic mark. However, in July of 2022, the Federal Subsistence Board, over objections from the state, implemented a closure of sheep hunting on federal lands in Game Management Unit 24A and federal lands west of the Sag River in 26B. This closure disrupted our experimental design by closing approximately 25% of our treatment study area, which was specifically chosen because it encompasses our long-term minimum count area. Despite inquiries, we have yet to receive an explanation or specifically how what biological mechanisms that closing hunting to old age male classes would aid in overall population recovery. This is concerning because recognized scientific principles predict this type of hunting strategy should have little impact on reproduction and should be largely compensatory for survival. Furthermore, it is unclear to us how closing this area to the harvest of mature males while continuing to allow harvest of ewes from the same population is biologically defensible, as we are unaware of any recognized scientific principle that would support this decision as optimal in aiding population recovery. Lastly, it was postulated that we were missing 6 of the last 10 cohorts from this population. Age structure of our harvest data shows this not to be true. Indeed, the cohorts from 2013 and 2014 are at low levels, as well as the overall population being low yet stable since 2018. During our June field work, we were able to classify from the ground about half the rams in our trend count area. We did not observe any gaps of rams in the quarter, half, or three-quarter cruel classes. This closure will cause substantial damage to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game study and diminishes the ability of the state to gather important scientific information relative to management. The closure will necessitate modification of our study design, and discussions on how best to move forward are ongoing. These options include potentially expanding the study areas and including comparative ewe demographic work. And with that, we're going back to Tom.
Thanks, Brad. So clearly, stakes are very high. This is a complicated situation, but we do want to mention that making decisions based on incomplete data won't benefit user groups or the resource. And speaking for the department, we sincerely appreciate the time and effort and interest of all who took the time to comment and all who are attending the meeting today. Sheep hunters are clearly a passionate and involved group, and we're all very invested in a positive outcome. This was meant to be an informational meeting to provide an overview of populations and harvest levels. So we're specifically not recommending any of the following mitigation strategies. But it is important to note that there's a distinction between actions that will have a biological effect and those that are allocative or social. And it's important to note that each come with risks, trade-offs, and unknowns. For example, it's very reasonable to expect that a restriction in one area might shift harvest pressure to another mountain range or game management unit. We've noted this on an informal level over several years, as the sheep hunter gossip telegraph suggests that one area or another has big rams or has avoided the worst of winter conditions, and people seem to shift effort based on some of that information. Likewise, many biological strategies might not be as straightforward as they seem on the surface. Please don't take this to mean that we're throwing in the towel. We're quite the contrary. We're not saying it can't be done, but instead we're pointing out that in order for any action to be successful, rather than merely symbolic, we need to take an objective look at what we're doing and where we're headed. And as with any mitigation measure, the first questions should be, where do we start and what do we prioritize? I want to take a quick look at a few potential biological mitigation strategies and just point out some of the issues associated with them. Habitat improvement, for example, burning, is actually a component of the intensive management law. As with any IM project, the department would be required to conduct a feasibility assessment addressing the questions of cost and scale. What scale would we need to be effective on with such a program? Land ownership and management status may also complicate a potential effort. In just casual conversations with some folks at DNR and our fire habitat coordinator, suggests that the time frame to accomplish even a successful burn project on a small scale can range from 5 to 7 years. And that's assuming just strictly state land ownership with a minimum of cross-agency coordination. Given the current status of sheep statewide, a viable source population for transplants probably doesn't exist at this point. More importantly, we have some potential disease concerns anytime animals are moved from their native home range to another. Note that while sheep are regularly translocated in the lower 48, many of these herds have already experienced lethal Mycoplasma pneumonia outbreaks. And so disease transmission from one area to another is much smaller concern down there. Supplemental feeding is complicated mostly by cost and logistics. Since sheep mostly winter in low densities and small groups, a potential action would have to operate on a large scale to be effective. Unknown risks include potentially congregating animals, which could spread disease, increase predation risk, or alter animal behavior. All of these unintended consequences have been observed in other supplemental feeding programs in other jurisdictions. As far as predator control, sheep aren't off the top an intensive management species. Now, this is not necessarily a showstopper, but more pragmatically, there are multiple species of predators that utilize sheep, and different predators have greater or lesser effects in one mountain range or another, or different game management unit. Along those lines, selectively moving one predator might cause an unintended increase in another predator species. And finally, eagles are federally protected. We'll leave that there. Much like habitat enhancement, though, before any predator control is conducted, the department would need to complete a feasibility assessment, which would be returned to the board for review prior to the board adopting regulations that might authorize such a program. And there are some, these strategies here on this slide are some, probably not all, of the social or allocative strategies that the board, or allocative tools that the board has to address the current issue. Some of these are done regularly for other species, others a little bit more complicated or have not been tried before. Again, not saying don't, just saying make sure that we make these decisions based on the best information possible. In general, from the least restrictive to the most, possible changes include no action, leave doing nothing, leave seasons and bag limits unchanged, and hope that populations rebound on their own. We could potentially align season dates with moose and caribou. Most sheep seasons open prior to moose and caribou seasons in many of the same units, so shifting dates so that sheep coincides with moose and caribou seasons would presumably ask hunters to choose which species to hunt. That could alter harvest levels, while still maintaining open opportunity for sheep hunters to pursue sheep on a harvest ticket. The season could be shortened or move the start date later, potentially, or reducing overall harvest, as 50% of the sheep harvested each year are taken in the first 10 days or so of each season. Dates could then be adjusted to reach desired harvest levels. Limiting motorized or aircraft access, creating new controlled use areas or non-motorized zones has the potential to reduce overall harvest. It's been proposed that a rotating hunt period based on the last name be implemented that potentially separate the season into blocks and allowing hunters to participate in a specific block on a rotating basis according to the first letter of their last name. Changing bag limits to 1 sheep in 2, 3, or 4 years is also a possibility. Currently, residents in most areas can harvest a sheep every year. Non-residents are limited to 1 harvest every 4 years. Lots of options if the board is interested in exploring this method of restricting harvest. A drawing hunt will restrict opportunity statewide or in a particular unit severely. And it is worth reiterating that in places where draw hunts have been implemented, we have not seen a corresponding long-term change in the population trajectory. Season closures are probably the final option. This, of course, could be implemented at any one of several different scales. At any rate, it will certainly increase the number of mature rams on the hill in the short term, but also likely to result in sort of a gold rush once things open back up. And regardless of which biological or allocative strategy the board chooses or does not choose in the future, the department wants to make sure that any of these strategies are implemented in such a manner that we can rigorously and objectively evaluate whether they're a success or a failure. With that, I'll close. Thanks to the board, thanks to the public for their time, and I hope that this presentation was valuable. We are available for questions, and we can also refer specific questions to area staff if the board has questions about a particular game management unit or mountain range or count area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Quite the lengthy presentation, lots of information. Now, questions from board members for the presenters. Okay, Jake. Jake, you had a question? Can't hear you. Okay. Go ahead, Jake.
It looks like he's unmuted, but maybe having a difficulty with the headset. You could just try removing the headset, Mr. Fletcher, if you want to give that and unplug it. Maybe that'll help. That did not work.
Okay, well, other board members, questions?
And Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Go ahead, Christie.
we can have board support staff move Jake to the other room and help him with his audio and put him back. But I know if he'd like to do
Right.
that, but I know he may want to hear what others say. Go ahead. Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any other board member questions? That's. Come on, James, you must have a question for the presenters.
Yeah, I actually did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have one question for Brad. Did you say that the project up in the Brooks Range was going to conclude in 2023, or we're still trying to get it started? I missed that. I'm sorry.
We've secured funding, and this year with the genetic component, we launched it in June of 2022 with the intention of deploying the callers this March. But with the federal subsistence closure, that we're back to the drawing board a little bit and trying to figure out the best way to move forward. So very initial stages of the research.
Got it. Okay, that thanks a lot, and that clarifies it. I just was concerned that we'd started and we were halfway through a project trying to gather data, and all of a sudden our constant had changed. So no, that's great, and obviously not great news, but hopefully we can find a solution or a path forward. Thanks for answering that question.
Yes, sir.
Al? Al Barrett had a question.
Well, Mr. Chair, I know he was experiencing some internet issues earlier. Maybe that's it. And board support staff, I think, is going to reach out to him to try to assist.
Yeah, he had his hand up. So
Yeah.
Is Jake available now? Can you unmute and speak?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. And I apologize if James asked this question while I was stepped outside there for a little bit. First off, I want to say, man, we asked for some information and we got it. It was a great presentation. But is Mr. Want still around? I got a question for him if he happens to still be in the room. It's a pretty cool deal to be on the receiving end from one of these. It's neat that he's participating here. How's it going, Mr. Want?
Well, I think pretty good, but I haven't heard the question yet.
No, hey, in slide number 19, you had some statistics there. It started in 1976, doing some survey stuff and with like a helio courier and a super cub. Before that time, were most of the surveys done with just boot leather and binoculars and hunters in the field and of that type?
Well, it was a combination, but in 1949, Scott started to he did statewide or territorial wide surveys with an aircraft. And that was one of the first times they started using airplanes. And then in 1968, the Lyman Nichols survey was done with airplanes. So it started in 1949, but in the Brooks Range, there were only a couple of years, like the 68, after 49 at 68, and then in those 70s where they started using aircraft.
Hey, thanks very much, Mr. Want. You answered my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is Al back?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just having a difficult time with my internet service here, but just anecdotally, and I know predators play a small portion, it seems like, in sheep recovery or sheep populations growing. But I have noticed anecdotally that over the last 3 or 4 years that the wolverine harvest has been substantially high, just from the amount of what trappers have been bringing into auctions and what trappers have been bringing into the into the shop and stuff. So I don't know if we could look at some aspects of that, if they're on high wolverine populations year that we see a little more mortality on the sheep population. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Member Barrett, through the chair, absolutely of interest. We were really surprised in the early stages of the 13D work to realize that wolverines were very, very effective on both adults and lambs. And that would certainly be something that, as a matter of fact, they were more of a factor than anything other than eagles on that project. That was a real surprise to us when we started collaring animals in 13D, but we had notable levels of wolverine mortality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, this really goes to Tom, Brad, and then the crew there. Any issue with other projects getting funding resources for the organization, specifically for sheep? Are there any others out there that you've been looking for? And probably not trying to call anybody out at the department level or even at the commission level, but just curious if there's any other projects in the works that you are looking for funding for. Over.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Member Cooney, through the chair. The department has been really great about stepping up to the plate and funding our requests. As we mentioned, we do try to allocate funding for research and management projects based on need, and the department has been very aware that sheep have been sort of behind the curve for several years, and I've been very well funded. Brad's work has had some fits and starts along the way, but he's in position. And we're also, I don't want to put the cart before the horse at any point, but we're also working with some federal partners about a very, very broad scale demographic project comparing National Park Service jurisdiction, land and state land in adjacent units to allow us to control for weather. So we're optimistic that will come through in the short term as well.
Okay, Ryan has a follow-up to that, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through the chair to Member Cooney. On the other side of this equation, in the S&I side, the management biology safety will, you're probably aware that PR dollars are flowing heavily, and we recently were awarded a CIP over the next 3 to 5 years, and the lion's share of those monies are to be dedicated to survey work of some sort, and that'll be inclusive of many species. But I think the management side will see a pretty good boost in survey monies for the regions and the area offices.
Thank you, Ryan. Stosh, we can't see if you're raising your hand or anything. So do you have any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple quick questions here to Tom. With fewer legal rams on the landscape, is the department going to, what action are they going to take as far as sub-legal ram take and not the possibility of less people sealing their horns, or do they have anything going on to cover those?
Good afternoon, Member Hoffman. Through the chair, good to have you with us. Good to chat with you again. I can't speak specifically to that, although I can say that we're working very closely with Alaska Wildlife Troopers. Very grateful for close cooperation with our AWT staff here in Anchorage to I think the appropriate word would be aggressively handle sublegal take. To your second part of the question, I don't have good information about what might be harvested and not sealed, and that's certainly a concern. Although I don't have a good way to get a handle on that. That's certainly something that's at the back of our mind in the fall during the sealing process, is how many are essentially poached that we don't see, and I'm not sure how we would get good data on that. Thank you.
Okay, just one more quick question, Mr. Chair. Also, is there a way to, are we tracking the amount of hunting time or pressure on the rams that are taken now? Is the, let's see if I can word this correctly, the amount it takes to harvest the legal rams that we're harvesting now, is the hunting days increased? Do we have any measurements on that?
Member Hoffman, through the chair, yes, we do record hunter effort in terms of days in the field. That data is not yet complete for 2022, but it should be available somewhere in the not too distant future. But we have it historically, and that's certainly something we record on ceiling.
Thank you. That's all I got for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, Al, Brett.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question for Ryan. Is the department entertaining any negotiations with the Federal Subsistence Board on rescinding that portion of the closed area to, get it back into the study area so that, we'd have a really good scientific study in that area?
Through the chair, Member Brett, I'm not going to categorize it as negotiating. We've made our feelings pretty well known, and relying largely on, the work that Tom and Brad and Joe and all the area biologists have done, that, we didn't think it needed to be closed. I'm not aware of, other than staying that trend and continuing to reiterate that point, I'm not aware of other actions. I do believe Deputy Commissioner Mulligan is on, and he heads up our interactions with the Federal Subsistence Program. He may have more information, but you can rest assured we're going to keep telling them they didn't need to do it.
Hi, Member Brett, this is Ben Mulligan. Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, we looked at our options coming out of it, and even a request for reconsideration takes years in the process. And so at this point in time, if we want to get that out of a closure, we're better off coming into the wildlife cycle, offering a proposal to rescind that, which is next year. So, I mean, there's no real immediate recourse. And, as Ryan mentioned, all our sheep biologists did a full court press on this. And we did so, I mean, this was a topic that we did present to the board. They were well aware of it, and still went ahead with it. And so we'll see what happens at the end of the day. I mean, that was a contentious meeting, and we're still dealing with the fallout of that.
Go ahead, Al. You got a follow-up?
No, I appreciate the comments on that. I think that was a real disheartening decision that the Federal Subsistence Board made.
Okay. Any additional questions from board members for the department? I think we got a full set of information here.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Oh, I apologize for interrupting. I see Member Fletcher's hand is up.
Okay, Jake, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Chair. I apologize for that. I don't know where my little hand raise button is. I got to do it manually here. But I guess it's just a general question here. I drafted a letter on behalf of the Board of Game to the Big Game Commercial Services Board regarding and stressing, the take of sublegal sheep and how, its guides were held to a higher standard. I was kind of disheartened to see the numbers there. By guided non-resident sublegal take, but specifically in Unit 19C, were there any sublegal take from guided hunters?
Member Fletcher, through the chair, yes. I can think of one specifically that we sealed here in Anchorage. There was a second. We had I believe 3 guided sublegal harvests this year. I remember one specifically from 19C, but I don't remember off the top of my head where the other 2 are from.
Hey, I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Any additional questions? We haven't heard any questions. Lynn, go ahead. You need to unmute. Okay.
I'm trying to get my mouse to work. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of to follow up with Member Fletcher's comments. So I got a question by your slide or page 26 on 19C harvest. It kind of, it appears that the resident hunters kind of did self-regulate their numbers down, but yet the guided end of things still stayed, and it appears to be relatively high. Do you have any numbers on what the actual effort was, resident and non-resident, actual number wise?
Member Keogh, through the chair, we're trying to pull that out of the data set here.
Okay. And I guess I'll just follow up a little bit on, so on page 20, you also had the success rate of non-residents in that 19C was 50 to 7, or statewide was 50 to 70%, resident was basically 20 to 30. And I mean, I'm generalizing there, but it would appear that if that's the case, that the effort from the guided end of things was still significant in 19C.
Member Kia, through the chair, it looks like we don't have complete data for the 2022 season yet, but it looks like Alaska residents, total number of residents that hunted was right around between 100 and 130 from say 2006 through 2019, dropped to 95 in 2020. And then 64 hunters in 2021. And I don't remember the second part of your question, sorry.
I guess I was just going off of the general success rate statewide and kind of correlating it over to the 19C harvest. But so maybe it doesn't correlate that well. But it just seems like the resident hunters seems like they self-regulated abruptly from 19 to 22, and the guided effort or the guided harvest has gone down, but I just kind of wondered about the effort. If the percentages were, the harvest percentages were still fairly stable to what the statewide average was.
Hard to say on a short-term basis. That's something we could pull at a later point as the data comes in. Sorry for not being able to give you that at our fingertips.
No, that's okay. Thanks. I appreciate the answer.
Go ahead, Jake.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chair. One more quick question here on slide number 52, the current harvest levels in unit 19C. I see the non-resident and the resident, but there's a portion there that's unknown. What constitutes that unknown? What makes up that unknown besides being unknown?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn this one over to Kyle Smith. Kyle's been crunching the numbers for us here.
Through the chair, Member Fletcher, the unknown is what happens when we get a report, a harvest ticket report, but the overlay never gets submitted. So we don't actually know who that goes to. It depends on where they got it from. They could have got it from like a Fred Meyer, and Fred Meyer never sent in the overlay. So we never know. However, if we look at the report card, sometimes we can see a guide's name listed and we'll know that they were at least guided. But for the amount of data we had to pull together for this, we weren't able to go through all of the reports and clean those up.
Hey, I appreciate that, Kyle. Thank you very much.
Okay, any additional questions from board members? Ruth, you haven't said anything yet, so you have the opportunity. But if you don't want to, that's okay too.
You know, I did have one question, and somebody already asked it, so
Okay.
so I think you guys already covered it.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, this is Stosh.
Go ahead, Stosh.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess since the last set of questions have all been in 19C, and I'm looking at the sheep harvest record since 2018, it's dropped drastically. Right now it's close, it's not done yet, but it's around 30. And in normal years, it was considerably higher than that. Does the department have any idea where they would start looking at EO authority? If the trend keeps going and we drop down to 5 total sheep harvested in that unit, would that be a threshold, or is there any talk about any of that to the department? Mr. Chair, did my question come through?
I heard you fine. I'm wondering, maybe Ryan might want to speak to that, or Ben Mulligan, or Deputy Commissioner Mulligan.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through the chair to Member Hoffman. That was a conversation we had last winter as well, and it's still a question, Member Hoffman. When is low enough? Presenting on a large scale in some of these large scale areas in the different mountain ranges, there are places that have a lot of sheep to look at, a lot of sheep to choose from still. Places such as 19C, where we're seeing that area or the harvest decline fairly steeply at this point. Then we think about other areas, and Tom had mentioned that we have, considered island populations, Glacier Mountain CUA, the Yukon-Tanana uplands and things like that, where I would say that's the other end of the extreme, and 19C is probably somewhere in between there. That conversation is ongoing, for sure. The information that we presented really focuses on the history and full curl management, which is, I'm repeating what we said last time. And that's where we are today. Doesn't mean it'll be there necessarily tomorrow or in the next week. We have not ruled out closures. And I believe Mr. Loheis touched on that as well. And we have to consider at what scale those would be used at, and when would we implement those. I also think it's really important to point out that biologically, we've heard a lot about full curl management and how that has carried us and has worked out pretty well. The total number of sheep on the mountain, that's also biological, but when we start talking about closures and things like that, and what is our threshold, that's biology and social input and tolerance of what people can accept and what they feel about. So it is a deeper question. We haven't ruled out closures. I can't tell you that if the harvest goes down to 5, though I promise you we take pretty special attention to that, that would be the trigger for it. But we haven't ruled it out, and we continue to discuss that very question. From my perspective, it's a very hard question.
Thank you, Ryan. I agree. That is a hard question. Appreciate the response.
Okay, any additional questions from board members? Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess one more question, so we seem to be targeting 19C here. What do we have a number on what the youth hunt took out of those sheep that were harvested by residents? What the youth hunt got out of that?
Member Keogh, through the chair, we don't have specific information on youth hunt success by game management unit, but statewide in 2016, it's 13 animals harvested on the youth hunt. 2017, 21, 2018, 21, 2019, 13 harvested, 2020, 20 harvested, 2021, 19 harvested, and 2022, 6. But those are statewide numbers. I believe Mr. Pierce is on the line as well from McGrath, and we might refer specific 19C questions through him with Ryan and Chairman Burnett's thumbs up.
Okay. Jake, you have a question?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just to kind of continue on what Mr. Keough was talking about, and this might go directly to Mr. Pierce too. That RS 380 permit, what's the participation level like that, and the success rate? How many people are picking up those permits, and how many people are going hunting, and how many people are successful?
Yeah, hello. Through the chair to Member Fletcher, this is Josh Pierce. I'm the area biologist in the McGrath area. I'm responsible for 19C, and I just looked real fast. I wasn't prepared to answer the question about youth hunt, but I do not believe any sheep were shot in the youth hunt in 19C this year. That was just a real fast peruse of the data that I had open in front of me. And then as far as the winter sheep hunt goes, last year there were no sheep taken in that hunt, and participation is typically very low. It's no aircraft use, and so that really keeps numbers down. It is anywhere from 0 to, I don't know what the most we've ever had, probably still less than 10 hunters participating in that in any given year. The quota is anywhere from 2 to 5. We've only met that quota of 5 once. And as I said, last year harvest was 0. So 0 to 5 sheep is kind of the range that we look at with real low participation.
Hey, thank you very much, Mr. Pierce.
Okay, any additional questions from the board? If not, then I want to thank the department. I want to thank Deputy Commissioner Mulligan and Ryan for hanging in there, and all the biologists for their hard work. And the board has a lot to think about here. We'll be thinking about it. Go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I would echo that you know, the presenters, we had Mr. Loheis, Mr. Windling, Mr. Watt, Mr. Smith, but every person on here contributed to this process, and it became pretty obvious. It was obvious very quickly that there was going to be a lot. We apologize, you know, if we went a little long, but we did. It was really important to give some of the historical background, the present situation, things we are doing, and then to provide some thoughts for you guys to process. But we again appreciate your flexibility with this and your time.
Okay, Al, you have your hand up.
Yep, I just wanted to, you know, reiterate what you were saying. I think the department did an outstanding job for the short amount of time they had to compile this whole information in a 2-hour meeting. There was a lot of good information. There's a lot to think about, and there's a lot that, you know, I can ask, you know, the department on the side and prepare for the next board meetings and proposals that'll be coming up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Member Brett. Anything else from the board? Do we have any other business to come before us? And Christy, do you know of anything else that we have to come before us?
No, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Stosh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time in the meeting, I'd like to convey to the board and the department of my intention to submit a board-generated request at next month's meeting to close Unit 19C for 5 years. So I'd just like everyone to know that I plan to bring that up at next month's meeting.
Thank you, Stosh. And Christy, do we have a date for that meeting in November yet?
Mr. Chairman, we do not, but I'm sure we can get that date set by next week.
Okay.
And I'll be in touch soon with the board members.
Right, and that's the meeting, our annual meeting where we consider agenda change requests in advance of our regular in-cycle meetings. And So that will be sometime in November.
Mhm.
Thank you. Anything else to come before the board? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn from one of the members.
I move to adjourn, Mr. Chairman. This is Al Barrett.
Okay, we have a second.
Second. This
Okay,
long.
well, with unanimous consent, we are adjourned then. Thank you. And thanks, everybody. And thanks, public, for listening in.